Welcome. This is the Women's Engineering Society's talk with Katrine Marçal, the author of Mother of Invention, How Good Ideas Get Ignored in an Economy Built for Men, part of our celebration of International Women in Engineering Day, which was yesterday. I'm Elizabeth Donnelly. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Women's Engineering Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar. I will be talking to Katrine Marçal, who is a best-selling author on women and innovation. Her first book, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, has been translated into more than 20 languages. Margaret Atwood called it a smart, funny, and readable book on women, economics, and money. It was named one of the Guardian's Books of the Year in 2015 and won the Lagercrantz Award in Sweden. BBC also named Katrine Marçal one of its 100 women in 2015. She works for the Swedish newspaper Dagens Nyheter, and in her role as a financial journalist, she's had the opportunity to interview many of the world's leading economic thinkers, from Nassim Taleb to Mariana Mazzucato. She's also had the pleasure to become one of only a handful of European journalists to get an exclusive interview with Michelle Obama before the publication of her memoir, Becoming, in 2018. She has given keynotes at institutions such as Oxford University Business and Economics Programme, London School of Economics, and the Royal School of Technology in Stockholm, and delivered 2 TEDx talks. She lives in a village in England with her husband and 3 children, and we are delighted to welcome her to the Women's Engineering Society. Hello, Katrine.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, Elizabeth, and thank you all for letting me join your celebrations this week and for letting me talk about something that I am very passionate about, which is women and innovation. And this is my book, which is actually coming out in the UK today. And I'm particularly happy, I must say, to be here with you because this book was first published in Sweden last year, and it actually became a bestseller in Sweden a lot because of actually the engineering community in Sweden. Some of the first people who called me up after the book came out were, the Royal School of Technology, female engineers there, the Technological Museum in Stockholm. And I've since then been doing work with these institutions on this perspective. So particularly happy to be here with you today, and particularly this week, which is, of course, all about women in engineering. So where am I going to start this story? Well, I was thinking about that the other day when I tried to put together this presentation. And I think for me, really, this book kind of in a way started in my own childhood. So this is me in 1984, looking great. And this was also the year when my mother decided to retrain. And she went to university and she studied computer science. And she became a computer programmer. And I grew up with her, obviously, being a computer programmer in the 1980s. And I remember almost all of her managers back then being women, these respectable Swedish ladies with big curly hair who came to our house and brought cakes for me and my little sister. And that was the image of tech that I grew up with. And then obviously it changed. And when my mother retired a few years back, then computer science and programming in particular were extremely male-dominated fields. And these, respectable ladies with curly hair that I remember from my childhood, and again, I'm not that old, they were nowhere to be seen. And sort of the stereotype of what a computer programmer or somebody in tech had changed to, probably something along the lines of a young man in a hoodie. And I was always, as somebody who writes about economics and, is a financial journalist, fascinated by this story that I experienced so close at hand, how a profession in that way can go from female-dominated to male-dominated. And of course, what happened was that status and pay also went up the more men came into computer science. And today it's one of the parts of the STEM field where it seems to be the hardest to recruit women. So this was something that was at the back of my mind, and I didn't really quite solve this puzzle until many years later when I set out to write this book, Mother of Invention, which is published today. So that's the background, and I'm going to obviously come back and give you the answer in this talk. But first, just to say a little bit of what I'm planning to do here. So I'm going to make an argument here today, and I'm going to argue, based on the book, that first, women are excluded from innovation, and also things we perceive as feminine are also excluded and devalued when it comes to innovation and technology. And these two things working together holds innovation back. So that's the argument that I will be making. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to give you 3 examples from my book, Mother of Invention, and a little bit of a conclusion, the way I think about this. And then obviously we'll be having a discussion, and I'm very keen to hear what Elizabeth thinks about all of this. So let's just get started. So I want to start you off with, this example of innovation. Probably the classic example of what we perceive as a big innovation. 5,000 years ago, we invented the technology of the wheel. And it probably looked nothing like what you can see here in the picture, because it probably was some kind of pottery wheel. But still, this is a classic example of a big innovation. And after that, after the invention of the wheel, this was a form of technology that we applied to many different problems. We attached wheels to chariots and bikes and cars. We created things like the Ferris wheel, or we had, our friend the hamster used the technology of the wheel, at least from the 1950s when the hamster wheel was invented. And basically, almost all the time when we had something heavy that we needed to transport from point A to point B, we used the technology of the wheel. With one very notable exception, which is this one. Suitcases. Suitcases didn't get wheels until 1972, which is quite staggering when you think about it, because that's 3 years after we managed to put 2 men on the surface of the moon, and the same year that we drove this thing with wheels on the moon as well. And many people have thought about this. Many economists have thought about this, because it doesn't quite make sense. The technology of the wheel was 5,000 years old. The modern suitcase had at least existed for almost 100 years by then. We used wheels on trolleys. We had baggage carousels way before we had suitcases with wheels. So why didn't this, pretty obvious innovation strike us? And this is why this curious case of the wheeled suitcase has become a bit of a classic mystery of innovation. Nobel Prize winners in economics like Robert Shiller, or big thinkers like Nicholas Taleb, or very prominent thinkers when it comes to management, they've all sort of used this as an example, tried to figure out, how was it possible? How couldn't we see that this was a pretty obvious invention? Why did it take so long? And lots have been written about it, and it's become this classic mystery, a reminder to us that we might think that we're great when it comes to innovation, but actually these really obvious solutions like putting wheels on suitcases can stare us right in the face for 5,000 years before we decide to do anything about it. What I argue in my book is that none of these people and economists who've thought about this, they haven't found the right conclusion, because they've been missing the key to the whole mystery. And the missing key to the mystery of why we didn't get wheels on suitcases until so late actually is gender, I argue in the book. Because what I found when researching this book on women and innovation is that there actually were products applying the technology of the wheels to the suitcase long before this product was officially invented in 1972. But the thing is, they were all of these niche products for women. And they never took off, and they were never taken very seriously. Why? Well, because there was this perception about masculinity that no man would ever roll a suitcase. It's unmanly, a real man has to carry. So here's the quote from the official inventor of the rolling suitcase, Bernard Seidel, where he says, "At this time, there was this macho feeling. Men used to carry luggage for their wives. It was like the natural thing to do, I guess." And he's talking here about the resistance that his project met even in the 1970s and 1980s. He first couldn't persuade any American department store to carry this product. They thought no man will ever buy it. And well, women, they might buy it, but women don't travel alone anyway, was the assumption. If a woman travels, she will travel with a man who will then carry the suitcase for her. And the truth is that suitcases only began to roll when we changed our perspective on gender and these ideas that men must carry and that women's mobility must be limited. So this is a typical ad for a wheeled suitcase in the 1970s, again, marketed to women. But it took off, at the end of the 1980s, and by sort of the end of the 1990s, this product, which was for so long considered, unthinkable for any man to use, a niche product for women, had completely disrupted the whole global luggage industry, changed really what we mean with a suitcase, changed how we built airports and aeroplanes. And obviously, today, men don't seem very threatened by a set of these very small wheels. But the truth is that, as late as the early 1980s, they did. And the point I want to make with this story is that, the answer to the classic mystery of innovation that so many thinkers and economists have pondered actually was gender all along. But we're not so used to thinking about innovation and gender together. And we're not used to thinking about ideas of gender as something that can hold technological development back in this way, or delay these innovations that we now take for granted. But what I argue in the book is that's happening all the time. So let me give you another example. So this is, as you probably can see, the T-Ford, the car that's credited with basically putting the world on wheels and ushering in sort of the current automobile era. Henry Ford's great vision of creating a car that was affordable enough for the workers in his factories to be able to buy. And what I point out in the book is that it's interesting that the same year that he creates this product, which is supposed to be the car for everyone, he buys a completely different car for his own wife. This is the car or the type of car that his wife, Clara Ford, drove. And the big difference between this car and the T-Ford is that the car that Clara Ford, Henry Ford's wife, drove is an electric car. And as you probably know, at this time, there were a lot of electric cars around already. This is a quote from the New York Times in 1910 saying, being really happy about that it was now possible for an owner of an electric to install his own charging plant in his stable. So at the dawn of sort of the car industry, there were petrol-driven cars, there were electric cars, there were cars powered by steam technology, and all of these types of technologies were competing against each other. But what I talk about in the book, Mother of Invention, is that it's interesting how the electric cars of the time largely were marketed to women. So it wasn't a coincidence that Clara Ford drove an electric car. And some of you might have paid attention in the previous slide, the picture of her car, it actually has, beautiful inbuilt crystal vases for flowers. So these early electric cars were kind of a wealthy woman's car, or that's how they became perceived. And that's because they were slower, not initially, but eventually. They were more comfortable, they were safe, they were reliable, they were silent, they were clean. You didn't have to kind of risk your life by going out and cranking the engine going, which became a very dangerous task with the petrol-driven cars, especially when the engines got bigger. You could sort of quite conveniently start the car from the driver's seat. And all of these reasons made people perceive the electric car as a car for women. It was product developed with women in mind. Electric cars were the first cars to be created with roofs, as you can see in this picture, because there was also this idea that, a real man doesn't need a roof on his car. He doesn't care if he gets wet in the rain. Women, on the other hand, wanted a roof. So electric cars were made with roofs. And the marketing largely looked like here you can see in the picture. What's interesting, and what I talk about in the book, is that these feminine associations between electric car technology and women soon became a commercial problem for the electric car industry. Here's an executive complaining in 1916 that the gasoline car dealers have branded the electric as a car for the aged and infirm and for the women. So many male consumers, they bought into this idea that electric cars were for women, and if something is for women, it must be technologically inferior, so they didn't want it. And it's interesting, isn't it, how electric cars went from something perceived as feminine to this. So this is obviously Mr. Elon Musk with his Tesla Cybertruck, which does not have inbuilt crystal vases for flowers, quite the opposite. And here, it's the same form of technology. And actually, I argue in the book, this idea that electric cars were for women, and if something was for women, it must be inferior, that actually helped limit the size of the electric car market in those early days, and actually contributed to petrol-driven cars taking over and us then building a whole world for petrol-driven technology. It wasn't the main reason, but even in that really sort of big decision that we made about technology collectively, gender was a factor. So this thing that things branded feminine are considered inferior is something that I talk about in depth in the book. And they're often not just considered inferior, things branded feminine are often not even considered to be technology at all. What do I mean by that? Well, in order to explain that, I'm going to give you a third and final example from the book. And it has to do with this. So these are some ideas that people had about what humans should wear on the moon in order to protect themselves from space, which is a very dangerous thing for the human body. And as you can see, they are made from hard, kind of traditional materials. But the thing is, the actual technological solution to the problem, what should human beings wear on the moon, came from somewhere completely different. The solution came from this world of technology. This, as you can see, is a rubber tree. And it's a woman with a, under this beautiful dress, she is wearing a girdle. And the company that ended up coming up with the solution for what human beings should wear on the moon was a company specialized in making rubber girdles for women, a company called Playtex. And they didn't just make girdles, they were making bras and all sorts of underwear. And actually this brand, Playtex, was almost at the time in the US synonymous with women's underwear, in the same way that maybe today a brand name like Spanx, you immediately associate that to a certain type of female shapewear. And this was the company. They did have a military division because they had to open one during the Second World War. They were the ones that managed to solve the problem and actually ended up creating the suit that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin wore on the moon. And their sort of revolutionary technological solution was, let's make the suits soft. Because this is obviously where their expertise was. They were good at flexible, soft materials. And the spacesuits ended up, you can see here in the picture, ended up being hand-sewn by largely female seamstresses that were moved from the production of girdles and bras on into this task of creating the moon suits. And it was not an easy process. They won this contract because they were the only ones. This suit was the only suit that basically passed the tests. But NASA was hesitant in using them and didn't like a lot of what the seamstresses were doing, not because it didn't work, but because there were no technical drawings. But because the seamstresses, they used a different type of technological knowledge that is not expressed in those types of engineering terms. And in the end, this company, they had to hire a separate team of engineers whose only job it was more or less to create technical drawings explaining what the seamstresses had done after they had done it. So the technical drawings were not used in the process, they were only there to kind of reassure the client that these things would work. And obviously they did. Bras, in a way, I argue in the book, took us to the moon. But what's interesting, of course, is that technology like sewing, which is associated with women, still often don't count as technology, which this story of the moon suits and all the trouble on the way, I try to illustrate it in the book using this story. So things perceived as feminine often count as, inferior in a technological sense, which we saw when it came to the electric cars. And often they don't even count as technology at all. And this is hugely important, I argue, in the book, especially if you care about women and innovation and including women in innovation. We are very used to talking about things like the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, or the Iron Age. And why is that really? Why is it only the iron, the bronze, and the stones that count as technologies important enough to define a whole era? And what are the consequences of that narrative? Instead of talking about the Stone Age, we could have talked about the String Age. So that's a form of technology of the time, which was also very, very important. You can just imagine using string, you can tie things together, you can create fishing nets and all sorts of things. And women are thought to have been the inventors of string and rope technology. But it doesn't quite count as technology the way we tell the story now, does it? And the same thing, we talk about the Bronze Age. We could have talked about it as the Pottery Age. But ceramics, hugely important form of technology, is more associated with women and therefore often not seen as a technology or innovation in the same way. And instead of talking about the Iron Age, which we do, we could, as historians have suggested, talk about it as the Flax Age instead, because that type of technology was in many ways probably more prominent in people's lives. But we don't. And we end up with a history of innovation and history of technology where women are largely absent, which of course affects women today, learning about their own absence basically when studying these things. So, and this brings it back to my mother and where I started. Programming, when she was a programmer in the 1980s, was still able to be female dominated because it basically wasn't considered to be tech. To be a programmer, you basically just needed to be good at following instructions. And women were thought to be good at this. Women knitted from patterns or cooked from recipes. And if you could do that, go be a programmer. It wasn't considered to be tech at all. When women put wheels on suitcases, it wasn't an invention. And when electric cars became associated with women, they became ladies' vehicles or boudoirs on wheels, not technological marvels. And that's a story I try to tell in the book, Mother of Invention, how our definition of technology almost always has followed our definition of masculinity, and how that leaves women out and still has profound economic consequences today. Because on the labor market, skills that are considered to be technical tend to be the ones that also pay more. And if basically whatever women do almost is, not considered technical or technology, then women will end up in fields with lower pay. Programming, when my mother was doing it in the 80s, was neither high status or high pay. And this still matters very much today. So this is the percentage of UK venture capital that goes to women. And it's the same in Sweden, where I'm from, in spite of Sweden probably sort of trying to do more policy-wise when it comes to gender equality. Still, only 1% of venture capital goes to women, which means that, the future of AI and robotics and medicine and the business models of the future that will define our economies are still, created by mainly men. They almost have a complete monopoly here. 83% of European startup founders are men. And still, when it comes to technological products and services, around 90% of them are created and designed by men, in spite of women in the global economy being incredibly powerful consumers. Women are thought to influence over 80% of all consumer decisions in the economy. And still, they are this absent from innovation, and their ideas have a really, really hard time getting funding from the financial system. And this just doesn't make sense. It is, in many ways, a big, I argue in the book, market failure. And it's something that we really need to do something about, and we can talk more about that perhaps in the discussion. I just want to end on sort of slightly bigger note and try to explain why I am so passionate about this topic and so passionate about trying to do my bit in rewriting the narrative of innovation and technology with women added back in. Because I firmly believe that when we put the technologies and the inventions that have been associated with women and often created by women back into the big narrative about innovation, the whole story changes. So what do I mean by that? Well, we often think about the early history of technology a bit like this, like a story of humanity still walking around on all fours, being hairy apes. Then one day we got up and some man probably got a big stick and sharpened it into a spear. And that was the first form of technology. And everything else sort of comes from that. And if we think of the history of the early history of technology like this, which I argue in the book that we actually do, then our drive to innovate, our drive to invent tools and technologies is in a way inevitably tied to some kind of will to conquer, kill big animals and dominate the world around us. If we think of it like this, as the first form of technology necessarily being a hunting tool. And I argue in the book that this story still reigns supreme in many ways. If you go to a startup conference or something like that, they talk about innovation like this. It's all about disrupting, crushing it, owning it, move fast and break things. That's how they talk. And then we've been surprised when technology has done just that, in the last 15 years, broken things, sometimes very valuable things like, media markets, or some would argue even democracy itself. And we have a financial system that has been pouring resources into these innovations and technologies that are promising to disrupt, crush, and dominate. And technology doesn't have to be like that. We could have technologies trying to repair, tend, and cooperate. But these are values that we have, for some reason, no sense really, coded as feminine. And as we've seen, and as I argue in the book, things coded as feminine do not count. They are considered inferior. But the thing is, we've actually gotten our whole history of technology wrong. We have no idea if this story is true. We don't know what the first tools were or what the first kind of technology was. We are just guessing. And historians say that, it might as well have been the digging stick, which I showed in this slide here, which is thought to have been invented by a woman, probably. And that's not a hunting tool. That's a tool for digging up edible roots and insects from the ground. And just think about if our idea about how technology began wasn't about a man, one day picking up a stick and sharpening it into some kind of spear, but a woman picking up a stick and sharpening it into a digging stick. Then this whole narrative about what drives us as human, drives us to invent and to create new technology, it would actually change. Our will to innovate wouldn't be tied to our will to dominate and conquer. And this is why I believe that our insistence on excluding women from the history of innovation and the history of technology, and not just excluding women, but also excluding all of the things and materials and innovations and values that, for all sorts of different reasons, we have decided are feminine, that makes us fundamentally misunderstand ourselves and what even drives us to create technology and to create new innovations. And it also makes us kind of fundamentally underestimate what's even possible. And that's why I'm at least so passionate about trying to write women back into this story of innovation, because when we do, I believe the whole meaning of it changes and we understand ourselves much better, and so much, becomes possible in a way that really wasn't there before. So I'm going to stop there, and hope that Elizabeth has got some questions for me.
Thank you very much, Katrine. That was a really interesting talk, right from the beginning of history through to the present day. And I'm sure many people, watching today will have many questions. We have a chat box, and if you want to talk about the talk, put it in the public chat, and if you and then you can ask your questions there as well, and we will get to those in just a moment. So yes, I read the book and I absolutely loved it, and it's incredibly well written as well. Despite covering such a lot of technological and technical items, it's not a hard book to read. It's really well written, much the same way that you've given a great talk to us here. So I have a few questions. So you spoke about the seamstresses sewing these spacesuits, and I in the book you talked about the other models being hard, but it's really good to see the picture, because in the pictures you can see just how ridiculous they look, because of course now we equate a spacesuit with something quite soft. So what difficulties did they have with, and how did it actually work? Because I think you say it's something like 4,000 pieces of fabric and 21 layers, and it could only stitch one at a time.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible story, and I love it because it's something that's so very hopeful about it. It was full of misunderstandings and, conflicts. And I mean, you can imagine, seamstresses coming from bra production, trying to sort of work with these space engineers. And this was in the 1960s in North America. But it did still work out. I mean, the suits, that was probably the best technological solution. That was what Neil Armstrong ended up wearing. And, he didn't die, which was, that's what was at stake, basically. Just one small kind of rip, and, the deadly cold or super hot reality of space would have kind of crept into his suit and killed him. It was a triumph of technology, and I think it's such an inspiring story because it just shows what's possible when we break down these really random barriers between, oh, this is male technology because it's hard, and this is female technology because it's soft, so it's not technology. None of that makes sense. So I find it an inspiring story. I mean, just technically, it's fascinating because it's very well documented, like, most things that has to do with the moon landing. And there are, drawings and interviews with these seamstresses. But it's things like, they were doing it on much of the work on these, normal Singer sewing machines, and they redid them. So instead of kind of starting and stopping, they kind of fired one stitch per footfall in order to get that level of precision. Now, I don't know that much about sewing, and I think probably you do, Elizabeth, a bit more. But that sounds like, I can understand why they did that, but it must have taken so much time and required. Oh, yeah,
absolutely. Because I'm a great fan of the Sewing Bee, where they've got 4.5 hours to, produce a wedding dress or something, and they are really amazing seamstresses, and don't know what the tailors, I suppose, is the word for a man. But, for these women to do one stitch at a time, that must have just taken forever.
Yeah, and also all the layers. So some of it was sort of basically doing it blind. And they had, in the end, when all of the layers were together, they had these special, incredibly big machines that they were sort of sewing it on. And I find it, the engineers at this company, who were almost exclusively male, because that was the time, they were all made to take sewing lessons, sometimes for weeks and months, in order to kind of understand the problem and, work on this solution. So it really was, quite an inspiring company in that sense, that they seem to really have listened to that type of technological expertise and used it to, full extent.
Brilliant. And then you talk about AI, and I agree. I'm giving a talk next week that I've already recorded about AI at a summit, and we're very concerned that if you've got men putting the AI in, and it's not deliberate. It's very much without having women's contribution, then you get difficulty. So what was interesting was when Garry Kasparov was beaten by Deep Blue, which is the IBM computer, at chess, and yet you compare his computing achievement, you compare the AI achievement with Serena Williams playing tennis. Can you explain a bit more about that for us?
Yeah, so there's a chapter in the book called When Serena Williams Beats Garry Kasparov. And what I try to talk about in that book is the assumption that I think was made, and not least from sort of economic commentators, that if we could create machines that could beat Kasparov at chess, then they would also be able to do most other things that we need to keep the economy going. And what we know now is that hasn't happened. We still don't have those self-driving cars that we were promised would be everywhere in 2021, which is now.
Yeah.
And we don't have these robots going around cleaning houses. And I explain that by sort of contrasting Garry Kasparov's type of intelligence with the type of intelligence that Serena Williams, the world's greatest tennis player, displays, on the court. That is a type of sort of bodily, embodied knowledge. If she came on this webinar and explained everything to us about what she does on the court, that still doesn't mean that you and me, Elizabeth, would be able to go out and play like Serena Williams, unfortunately, because that's a kind of a knowledge that you need to embody. And that type of intelligence is much harder, or has proven much, much harder to replicate in machines. So these assumptions that, largely male developers of early AI made, that intelligence must be what kind of white male professor thinks about as intelligence, so being good at chess or solving complicated mathematical problems, that has proven much too narrow. And actually, we are in a situation where computers can easily beat Kasparov at chess, but they can't clean houses as well as human beings do, and these, so that like the easy problems, the problems we thought of as easy, actually have turned out to be the hard ones to solve when it comes to replicating them in machines. And I talk about how that, in my view, also has to do with gender, because intelligence sort of in the body is also something that has been considered more female for weird reasons, really. I mean, men have bodies as well, very much. But they've not taken us seriously, and that has actually shaped the development of AI and maybe even held it back.
Well, I would agree. I mean, you talk about the fact that computers can't see, and even if I had specialist coaching from Serena Williams, I mean, goodness knows why she would coach me, but I would still be completely unable to play tennis because I have an eye condition, which means I don't see in 3D. I have no depth perception. Uh-huh. So one of the problems I have when I'm playing tennis is I can hit it over the line, but I can't hit it back because I can't tell where the ball is going to land until it's past its apex. So I have no idea about predicting where the ball is going to be, how fast it's going to come, or even being able to hit it with my hand. And this is, so I can't play any ball sports really. So I think that's really important, because I think, when you look at flat screen TV, this is mostly how I see, you don't see that depth that most people can see, and I think that's something, almost because men don't necessarily think about that they haven't coded that in, as it were.
Interesting. I mean, what I then talk about in the book, drawing on the Serena Williams Garry Kasparov comparison, is so say if it continues like this, so it's much easier to automate certain type of tasks and really hard to automate things that more have to do with this embodied knowledge, what are actually the labor market consequences of that in the future? And that's something you can see already in many economic studies where, economists recently have tried to, guess whose jobs are going to go and whose jobs are going to stay, that they, many of these studies kind of point out that, and then don't make a very big deal out of it, which I think they should, that many female-dominated professions, especially around care in the economy, will be much more sort of robot safe, because those type of tasks are much harder to automate. So what will that mean, for the economy? I talk about in the book is, will men's jobs be automated, and we'll basically have to retrain unemployed truck drivers, to work in care homes, and, what will happen? And I compare it to the first machine age, the industrialization in the 1800s, that actually had huge sort of gendered consequences on the labor market as well. And still we don't talk about the current technological development in these terms, which doesn't really make sense, especially given how gender segregated all of our labor markets actually still are.
Absolutely. I'm going to answer a couple of questions in the chat. So Kate Bellingham asks, what are your suggestions for making changes so we move forward with these issues? Yes, that's the big, thank you for the question.
I think, and this is maybe not surprising coming from, somebody who's a financial journalist, but I do think that financial innovation is a big part of the solution, and the financial system, the way it works right now is a big problem. These numbers, that venture capital is the most extreme one, but it seems very obvious to me, and I go into that more in depth in the book, that the current financial system, is just unable to recognize, scale, and fund women's ideas. And that has to do, I argue, with sort of the logic that, for example, venture capital and the incentive structures that's sort of built into that. And we need other types of financing better suited for kind of capturing women's ideas and innovations. And I think even like a much bigger discussion around, where I ended the presentation, changing the values around innovation from this, disrupt, crush, and dominate, which has in so many ways at least guided where the investments have been going in the last 2 decades.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about the venture capital and say that because of the old-fashioned way of investing in merchant shipping, that it's much better for a venture capital investor to invest on a potential new Google, because if you invest in 5 of those, 4 fail but 1 wins, you get so much more back. And yet we know from micro, not that you mentioned this in the book, but micro investing for women in the developing world, you give them £100 and then it's a much safer risk. It's a much and they get a greater return on investment. And so I'm just wondering why it is that venture capitalists are just not interested in these fantastic ideas that women technologists have.
Yeah, because they're looking for it, as you mentioned. They're looking for a different type of business idea, something that can sort of create almost a monopoly on its market, and they are very willing to throw huge sums of money on these things that never turn into anything. And women don't seem to be starting those types of businesses. And I think financial models of types of investment that did probably smaller but larger amount of safer investments, because women are, as you mentioned as well, safer to invest in. But right now, those models don't really exist on that scale, and venture capital has become much more dominant. And, we don't even have to be talking about venture capital, even, the more conventional financial system. Women have a much harder time getting credit almost in any economy in the world, which really sort of stifles female innovation as well. So it's a big problem. And I think, money is, perhaps unsurprisingly, I would emphasize that. But I do think that, follow the money and then change that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's given that the world is run for money rather than for people, it's probably where we need to make the changes. So Kate Ward has asked, I'm often asked, why don't we do what we know works better? For example, apply known technical solutions. It seems it commonly takes at least 25 years for new technology to be adopted, perhaps because people are naturally risk averse. Have you, through your research, also found this to be the case?
Yes, definitely. I talk a little bit about that in the beginning of the book, that it can often take a long time, and but I mean, this book particularly deals with, I guess gender as one factor that can really hold these things back, and obviously there are more factors, but I wanted to focus on gender also to make this bigger point that I think we often think about technology and technological forces as this almost neutral power or neutral thing that's pushing the rest of us in front of us, and all the economy or even people can do is sort of adapt. And that's not really true. It's not this neutral force. And for me, in this book, just showing how gender, ideas of gender, delays innovation and shapes innovation and makes us fundamentally, I'd say, misunderstand innovation. That's a way of also poking a hole in that sort of idea that technology is this neutral force.
Yeah, I would agree, because it feels like it's this unrelenting driving us forward, but actually these are decisions that are made. I'm reminded of the invention you talk about, and forgive me, I've forgotten the lady's name, but this woman who can't walk properly, so she's using these crutches that hurt her shoulders and her arms. So she designs a rolling walker with a shelf, which she takes from her fridge so she can carry her suitcase, and she doesn't end up making any money from it. But this is $1 billion market. So why do you think that happened, that she didn't manage to get the credit or the financial support?
I mean, the thing that I see happening all the time, which is actually quite depressing, is how, so even if you look at female innovators that have done unarguably sort of massive things, like I'm thinking about just because I'm Swedish, Laila Åhlgren, who is basically the Swedish female inventor of modern mobile phone technology, because she was able to sort of solve the problem that they initially had by coming up with this idea that you should have like a green button, so you press the number first and then you kind of dial, which solved all of the problems they were having. And this is clearly something that has really shaped the modern world, and unarguably a great invention. I mean, hey, it's you invented mobile phone technology, more or less, and she never saw herself as an inventor, and she never made any money from it. The company she worked for basically told her to go all around the world and tell everybody for free about how to do this. And so it's I think women are discouraged from taking on, and the same with Aina Vifak that you mentioned, that I talk about in the book, the inventor of this wheeled walker. She never saw herself as an inventor, and she didn't saw what she had as a kind of an invention. And I see that time and time again when it comes to women. And I think it does have to do with the way we tell the story of innovation and technology. If we leave out, everything that women have almost ever done in this field, and say that if they done it, it wasn't technology, it wasn't innovation, then, it's going to be very hard for women and to see themselves as innovators. And then, of course, you don't go after the money, but also there is, very real discrimination going on. Man and woman will pitch the same idea. Investor gives money to the man and not to the woman. So behind that, shocking figure of women getting 1% of venture capital, there's a lot of ugly stuff.
Absolutely. So, in fact, Olivia Weston says, do you think gender diversity in the financial sector influences where we invest on an innovation or technology front in other sectors? I think you've probably just answered that by saying absolutely.
I do think so. I mean, obviously, venture capital is very male dominated, and also because men are still, have the money in the world. That's changing. We're actually going through a quite interesting shift of wealth in the coming decades, where women will inherit large sums of money and maybe become investors. But right now, the people that can write those big checks are largely men, and I do think that influences things.
Bridget O'Donovan asked a really interesting question. Do you think that the climate crisis and the rise in impact investing will accelerate the integration and value of feminine traits and values?
Oh, I love that question, because I think I so much agree with it. And that's actually where the book ends. You know, I'm sort of applying what I've been exploring around how ideas of gender can hold innovation back to sustainability. Where, I mean, in almost the same way, you know, now we laugh at how men wouldn't roll a suitcase with wheels, but we have a lot of similar things going on today, especially around sustainability, where, you know, we think that, oh, men will always, you know, want to drive big individual cars. So the solution to climate change can't be sort of investments in sort of more public transport solutions, you know, using high tech, or, you know, men will always, they will never change how much meat they eat and so on. So we still have these assumptions around, you know, masculinity and femininity in very similar ways as we used to have around electric cars or rolling suitcases. And I do think that shapes, you know, the solutions that, you know, we can see and we invest in when it comes to sustainability. But I completely agree. I think it's necessary. I think that, you know, like my last slide, the sort of move from disrupt, crush, and dominate to other values in the innovation system, regenerate and heal and all these things. That's where a lot of the technological solutions that will hopefully save our planet from this climate emergency will have to come from. And sort of the really big kind of philosophical almost point I try to make at the end of the book is that we still have this divide where we see technology as something male and nature as something feminine, right? Mother Earth. And we almost built this technological paradigm, you know, with this idea that the male forces of technology should sort of conquer and control the female forces of nature. And obviously that type of technological paradigm, if we stay within that, that's not going to help us fix the climate emergency.
Absolutely. And what I'm finding interesting as well is the mobile phone. This is a Galaxy S9 Plus. It's my work phone. And I've had it for 2 years and I'm not intending to replace it. It works very well. And I think the mobile phone companies are discovering that instead of upgrading a phone every 2 years, you get to a level of pretty fantastic swish mobile phone and people are not therefore throwing them away. So do you think that that's going to lead to a more, you know, we know that there are things like machines have built-in obsolescence so that people have to go and buy new ones. Do you think that they will actually start, I'm trying to think of an economic model that works in this world made for money, where we can retain our machines and not damage the planet, but at the same time make money?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. It's, I think it's, and there's a lot of work going on right now within economics, you know, because we have not sort of, if we do something that really harms nature or the planet, has traditionally just been counted as an externality within economics. So we haven't put that in as a cost in models. And, you know, now, of course, people are realizing we need to start actually calculating that as a cost. And that does change the whole thing. And I think it will continue to change the whole thing going forward. But I do really believe that also these, you know, gendered ideas about technology and nature and they need to go. We need to do it differently. And I think there are all of these things. I mean, what my book so much is about is that these random things have just been coded as female. Oh, it's female to have a roof on your car, you know, therefore it's not a good thing. Or it's feminine to roll a bag, or it's feminine to sort of care for the planet, or, you know, and they really we've sort of excluded them, and most of the values and the things that we've coded as feminine, and and they are just as applicable to men really, but we've decided they are feminine and therefore inferior. Bringing them back in, that's where the solution lies. And I think there's other books coming out. I'm just reading this one, How Women Can Save the Planet by Anne Carve, just came out, which is all about climate change and women. So I certainly think that something is happening here.
Brilliant. We have got one more question, but I also want to say to our audience, first of all of you registered, we will be emailing you a 30% discount code for Katrine's book. So thank you for attending. And one of our attendees, Jenny Evans, has said, who is the target audience for your book?
Well, as broad as possible. I mean, in Sweden, I thought, I don't know, that it came out in Sweden. I didn't think that the target audience would be male engineers, but it really was. Those were the ones that, really read it. Obviously, female engineers as well. But it's a broad audience. I want, obviously everybody wants to be read by a lot of people, but I do think I've tried to do this as accessible, for a large market as possible. And I think even hopefully teenagers can read it as well, and and change the way we think about these things.
That's brilliant. There is one more question, if you can answer very quickly, but it's a very big topic, and I'm only asking this because it's the last question on the chat. Where do you think female innovators in developing countries that have deep patriarchy roots could start changing the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge problem. And I would again sort of point to the financial system and the huge problems they have in accessing capital in those countries, and really a need of, financial innovation in order to unlock the potential of these women. So again, I would say that the financial system is where that's something that needs to be fixed. And it's in the interest of capitalism and the financial system as well to unlock that potential. I really believe, because they are leaving money at the table because they are not
absolutely. If you're leaving, if you're not investing in 50% of the world's population, then there's a huge amount of money you're leaving on the table. Mm-hmm. Anyway, this has been an absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you. The comments have been really brilliant. Thank you for hosting the event. Interesting discussion, for a really thought-provoking talk, and for thanking you for your time. So thank you very much, Katrine.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Do buy her book, Mother of Invention, How Good Ideas Get Ignored in an Economy Built for Men. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.